Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, where is home for you? What is home? It's something that I've reflected on a bit over the years. Ministry has taken me and our family a number of places, not that far, but still unfamiliar to us. It's often felt like an adventure. Following my call to ministry, it took me to North Carolina for a summer and Washington State for a year. It took us to Milwaukee, which isn't that far away, but I had never been there before. And then we were in the Cambridge-Isani area north of Minneapolis for over 10 years. Had never been north of Blaine on Highway 65, so there you go. Each of those places stretched me and required adjustments. I've told this story before, but I remember the townhome we moved into in Menomonee Falls, a northwest suburb of Milwaukee, and at some point in the first months there, I remember just standing at the front door. We had a little window at the top, and I just kind of was staring out the window and wondering, how did I end up here? It was a little disorienting. Maybe if you've ever picked up and left the place you can relate to some degree, but despite whatever periods of adjustment, in every place that ministry has taken me and our family, we have found a home there. Moving back to this area, in fact, was the first familiar place I'd lived since starting in ministry. But it makes you think about the meaning of home more when you have those kinds of experiences. Home is more than a location or a particular place. You can find your home in family and friends, in a community of faith. Above all, you can think of home in spiritual terms, in relationship to God. People often like to think about home as a constant, a place that never fundamentally changes. But our faith invites us to think about home from a unique perspective. Today's passage from Hebrews is part of an epic retelling of key figures of faith and how they lived. It's profound because it shares their highs and lows, their joys and challenges. The author reminds us that by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out not knowing where he was going. Abraham's journey meant leaving his home and traveling for many years across hundreds of miles. He didn't know where he was going. This idea of place was important for Abraham, and it ultimately found its fullest expression in Mount Zion and the land of Israel. But this whole passage is an exploration of this idea of place, of home, of ultimate destination. Do you have a sense of ultimate destination? What are your assumptions around home? Is your greatest hope to settle into a place and stay there as long as possible? Or are you more of maybe an adventurous type? Are you looking to go somewhere else, to follow wherever your greatest aspirations will lead you, to follow where you are led in faith? The expectations you bring to home and to your ultimate destination can shape your life significantly. The Hebrews passage continues, by faith Abraham stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. temporary, intense, foreign land. The author of Hebrews is reframing and redefining what home means, of what a life of faith is like. Living in faith can mean living somewhere temporarily, being a foreigner, looking ahead to a different kind of home. Although God promised to show him a new land when he set out from Haran, he made another remarkable promise that we're reminded about in Hebrews, that he would become the father of many nations and peoples, as many as the stars of heaven and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Two promises that were just epic in scale. And again, the passage concludes, all of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way, make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. The author of Hebrews is redirecting the aim of faith. The point of faith isn't to finally lay claim to a permanent physical home or defend your homeland, whether on Mount Zion or Mount Gerizim or Mount Olympus for that matter, as much as it is to aim for a home that is not of a particular physical place. That home is one that as Christians we sometimes associate with heaven, but it's also a home we can experience in the presence of God in this life wherever we are. Some Christians hear those words about a heavenly home and stop there. Their focus becomes entirely otherworldly. And yet the story that Scripture tells is that when Jesus came into this world, heaven broke through. And when we live in faith, the joy and peace of heaven continues to break through. We have a purpose not just for some future home, but for our current one. Every one of us, in some way, whether we have words for it or not, has a vision for a better place, literal or figurative, a new home for us and for the world. A new home, perhaps, where every person can be given the opportunity for a full life of peace, health, and security. In faith, we get a glimpse of it. We greet it from far away. And we get a sample that's real and that actually makes a difference, that brings tangible hope and transformation. And so we're called not simply to wait for that better land, but in faith to share the experience of it. Christian faith affirms the value and meaning of every place, but it invites us to see that God's presence is not simply limited to any one place. There is some danger in connecting faith in particular places too deeply. There is a sacred quality to the places where we live. Since moving back to this area, my kids are now the fifth generation to have grown up around the Lake Minnetonka area, and that has real meaning for me. And yet, as Christians, our primary goal is not to seek a physical country or place. It's not to mark it as ours. Instead, we live in the world, but not of it. When people of faith lay claim to physical places as given by God for them exclusively, pain is often the result. In fact, that's some of the history in so many parts of the world. It's made even more problematic when people of any faith seek to install their narrow version of faith into a society as the ultimate rule of law. That includes Christians as well. For much of Christian history, religion and government were fused. After the first 300 years of the Christian movement, Constantine won a key battle and began the establishment of Christian faith at the center of the Roman Empire. Some today may look back at that as a high mark of Christian history, but any serious examination of the intersection of religion and empire is filled with warning. Christian empire led to the Crusades, which in turn led to the death of as much as 10% of Western Europe from ongoing war over multiple centuries that never accomplished its purpose of laying claim to the Holy Land for either side of that war. In more recent history, religious war in Europe has left much of Europe disinterested in faith because of its firsthand experience of the abuses that come when faith and nationalism intersect. And yet, we are in danger of forgetting those lessons. All of this reflects a desire to control and impose a definition of home on others not like us. Faith and empire historically led to abuses and the corruption of faith itself, which reformers like Martin Luther sought to undo. That's why the Lutheran tradition that All Saints is part of has traditionally remained wary of attempts to impose exclusionary Christian values or teachings on a governmental level, regardless of the political perspective. Jesus didn't lay out a perfect plan for a government or society. So any attempt to design that will be a human endeavor, and inevitably that kind of design will corrupt faith rather than perfect it. Our reading from today establishes an important refrain: by faith. It was by faith that followers of God lived. By faith means an open-ended life, not a life of certitude, not a life of power. It's a life that seeks blessings and God's presence wherever we find ourselves. It's a life that is primarily shaped by grace and love and compassion, but that necessarily also acknowledges the need for practices and behaviors that protect and build up rather than tear down. Our faith does reflect values for how to live, and we choose to live those out, often imperfectly. Faith provides personal peace and discipline for our own lives. The words of Jesus from today's gospel reading ring true. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Do not be afraid. God will give us the kingdom. And Jesus ultimately told Pilate that his kingdom was not even of this world. It's not for us to take over an earthly kingdom or impose our will on a kingdom as people of faith. Jesus' disciples specifically wanted Jesus to begin a political revolution, but he refused. When one of his disciples cut off an ear of a soldier, he stopped him and healed the man. He instead chose a life of sacrifice to give his own life rather than take life from others to accomplish his goals and purpose. Paul acknowledges the offense of this from the standpoint of worldly reasoning and power. Paul said, "The message of the cross is foolishness for those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the righteousness of God. For what will it profit a man to gain the whole world, but forfeit his soul?" Instead, Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. Follow me to a different figurative homeland defined by peace, not power, a different world and way of being. This is not a mandate. This is an ethical, spiritual, and voluntary call to acknowledge that an ethical life, a spiritual life, and specifically a Christian life requires times of personal sacrifice rather than the exertion of power. We can push back against that as humans, and we do and we will. It's our survival instinct. But over time, if we're honest, all of us see the wisdom of personal sacrifice in the context of the greater good and even our own good. Our deepest humanity is encountered when we choose goodness over personal gain. It's an ancient wisdom, but still relevant and fresh to acknowledge this. I often hear calls for public leaders and people with means to serve a larger good rather than just their own good. But of course, doing so very commonly requires personal sacrifice. Serving a larger good will rarely happen without individuals willing to place some of their own priorities aside. Though some of our decisions and power may seem inconsequential, all of us need to acknowledge that how we personally choose to live, to act, to speak, and what efforts we support all have an impact. Each person choosing to live in this way voluntarily can change the world. It's a kind of soft power that is greater than any hard power. We live in times in which some feel threatened by the loss of home, whether because of the presence of others, some even foreigners, like Abraham was, or whether because of changes in society due to technology, philosophy, climatology, or immunology. The way we think about home impacts us personally. It will shape our ability to adjust and respond to changes to the place where we live. When we find ourselves in a foreign place, whether it's foreign to us geographically or socially, we can find ourselves staring out the door, wondering where we are, how we've gotten to this place, and whether everything will be okay. But faith provides us reassurance no matter where we find ourselves. Do not fear, little flock. And it impacts us collectively as a society as well. How we think about homeland, in the words of Hebrews, will impact our welcome of the stranger, our ability to embrace change, and to love our neighbor. Hebrews tells the story this week and next week of faithful people who lived a life in tension and without a roadmap for the future, without certainty about what would come of it for them, but simply a desire to live faithfully, whatever the circumstance and whatever the consequence, by faith. May you live by faith and find your home in God's grace and his promise to be present with us wherever we are, wherever we go. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.